by talking to the elites, it gives them an idea as to what the future could be and where they might be able to fit in. It also gives them the incentives to perhaps move Putin on, and also it undermines his own regime. He himself already believes that people are out to get him. He's increasingly paranoid. I would say his inner circle is getting smaller. If he finds out that someone has been talking to people in the West, to governments in the West or authorities in the West, that person will be removed. That's repression. That will also then incentivize other elites that maybe Putin needs to be moved on. If they don't tell him, and he doesn't find out, he will assume they're doing it anyway, and so it increases the paranoia.
Hello and welcome to Frontline from Times Radio. My name's Alex Dibble. I'm Times Radio's Deputy Head of News. Today on Frontline we are joined by Dr. Stephen Hall, Associate Fellow and Specialist in Russian and Post-Soviet Politics at the Henry Jackson Society. With the Russian presidential elections taking place this weekend, Dr. Hall has published an article on the Henry Jackson Society's website entitled Declaring Putin Illegitimate. It is an argument as to why the West should use the Russian elections as an opportunity to declare the Russian president illegitimate. Dr. Stephen Hall, welcome to Frontline.
Thank you, Alex.
Wanted to start, before we get into your article, to just go through the mechanics of the Russian elections this weekend. How is it working? And also, how is it going to be working differently to previous Russian presidential elections?
Well, the Russian elections have already begun. We've had voting happening in difficult to reach places in Russia itself and also in the illegally occupied Russian territories. And what we've seen in regards to Donetsk and Luhansk, well, less so Crimea, but Donetsk, Luhansk, Kharkiv, Kherson, the areas Russia has occupied since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, that the pollsters have been going around with door to door with a Russian soldier behind them. So it kind of also puts a little bit of the voter in a particularly precarious place, let's say, if they choose not to vote for a certain gentleman who is the current president of Russia. In terms of how this election is going to play out, we see a 3-day voting poll. The argument for Russia is it's more democratic because it allows people longer to vote. However, in the past, this really became apparent with the 2020 referendum and the 2021 elections as well. It's been fleshed out again in the presidential election for this year. And we see that voting booths have occurred on park benches and the car boots of cars, these sorts of places. So it's much harder to monitor. And there are no election monitors this year, both internationally especially. Domestically, it will be that much harder because of where we are in terms of the Russian authorities and how repressive they've become since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
And one of the things you mentioned in your article is how the 3-day voting period allows the Russian authorities to actually gauge where things are at after day one and potentially make alterations. Can we say that in days 2 and 3?
Well, we can certainly say it. Yes, they will. It allows them to understand where. They also have the voting online that can be manipulated fairly easily if necessary. They have the 3-day voting as well. They have early voting. That's all ways to be able to manipulate the vote if it's not going the right way, or they decide that Putin officially needs to get 75% and 80% turnout, or the other way around. I forget what the presidential administration has stated. But if they're way below that level on day one, then we can certainly start to see on days 2 and 3 manipulation in order to make sure that Putin gets what has already been predicted.
So that's how the elections are going to work. Your article is, as I've said, entitled Declaring Putin Illegitimate. How do you feel these elections give the West an opportunity to make that declaration?
Well, Putin's constitutional term limits end in 2024. He changed the constitution in 2020 in a referendum, and that allowed him to stand again for another 2 terms, so 6 years each. So technically, if he can survive until he's 83, he's 71 now, we could be seeing Putin as president till 2036, and who knows what happens if he changes the constitution again or passes it on to his son or successor, who doesn't actually have an official son, but that's by the way. So he passes on to a successor. But the point is that this constitutional referendum, Russian law itself stipulates that every referendum should only be a yes or no to one question. There were 206 questions in the referendum about such things as putting in the constitution that marriage is only between a man and a woman. So it doesn't, whether Russians went and voted for a change in the presidential term limits or whether they voted for the change in the constitution, marriage between a man and a woman, among 204 other things, then we don't know. So it's illegal in regards to Russian law. Also, it's the perfect time in terms of he's reached his constitutional term limits with the death of Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader. That's another justification. We also see that millions of Russians living abroad as well, those who fled after the war, those who are already living in the West, will not have a voice in this election, especially if the embassies don't allow polling to occur or they circumscribe it. And also a lot of Russians in Russia will not go and vote because it's a pointless process. We know, I can predict with 99.9% probability that we know who the leader of Russia will be after this election, and it was the current president. So, yes.
And just for clarity, if the West were to be making this declaration declaring Putin illegitimate, how would they officially go about doing that, in your mind?
In terms of how they would officially go about doing it, it's the election results would come in, Putin would win the election, and Western governments could declare that they don't see the election as legitimate, that it is a facade, a charade, whichever word you want to use in this context, and that would be the official process in beginning this.
In a world where that declaration was
Yes.
made, what effect would it have? We'll sort of go through a number of different effects, but what effect, first of all, would that have within Russian politics?
Well, in terms of its relationship with the West, I think we can expect to see a lot more vitriol about how, this is the West is Russophobic, it's anti-Putin, anti-Russia, whatever you want to call it. We can expect to see on Russian state media that London can be reached by a nuclear weapon in 206 seconds, or however long their nuclear weapon. It's 206 at the moment, but it could go down to 203, or possibly a little bit earlier, depending on how they're feeling. So we can expect certainly a lot more of the so-called useful idiots on X, as it's called now, and social media, proclaiming that this is unfair, and certainly greater efforts at hacking, I would say, and other tactics that the Russian state has used in the past. That can be expected, and we can certainly expect more conflictual messaging, not conflicting as in they're not certain what they're going to say, but certainly trying to ramp up the idea of scaring the West into not doing this.
And you say in your article that the West should be not unconcerned, but should see that type of rhetoric for what it is, mainly rhetoric in response to a declaration of that type, rather than an actual genuine threat of a nuclear response or anything.
I still maintain that we're very unlikely to see a nuclear response. I don't believe that Putin would use a nuclear weapon, at least against a Western city. He might use a small nuclear weapon on the battlefield in Ukraine. That, unfortunately, could happen, but I don't think he's going to think now is the time to blow up London or Berlin or Washington or Paris. It is certainly, in my mind, bluff. And I think the West finally has to stop blinking and actually stand firm in regards to this. And declaring Putin illegitimate also highlights to the Russian population who do have Western leanings, who do believe that their future is a democratic Russia, as hard as it is to believe that will ever happen at the moment. We are very pessimistic. But I personally am optimistic it can happen, but that's by the by. It's going to take a long time. It gives them hope as well. And they've had hope taken away from them by the death of Alexei Navalny. Now, I can't say who done it, but I can certainly, assume, I think. But it gives Russians hope, and that they also need this hope for the future.
We'll circle back to Russia in a moment, actually.
Sure.
But another consequence of a declaration that Putin is an illegitimate leader of Russia that you outline in your article is that it would set wheels in motion militarily within the West. So firstly, Ukraine.
Yes.
You say in your article, designating Putin as illegitimate would be a new catalyst to revitalize Western unity in supporting Ukraine unequivocally. Why do you think it would be a new catalyst when all the other reasons why the West would want to support Ukraine, and those reasons have been there for the last 2 years, why would this be suddenly a new catalyst that would actually do something?
Because the declaration of illegitimacy for Putin would highlight that the international community has decided that finally decided that the Kremlin is out to overturn the international order by which we have done very well, and certainly trying to undermine the international order by which society has lived. And so this would be a way to finally support Ukraine to win this war as quickly as possible, and the declaration of illegitimacy for Putin would be a way to reunite wavering voices in the West. That certainly is what my hope in publishing this report was, a way to say, well, if we declare Putin illegitimate, it is a way to then give Ukraine what it needs to win this war as quickly as possible, ideally going back to its 1992 borders. That increasingly, because the West's support so far has been piecemeal, I would argue, is difficult, but it can certainly get Ukraine to a position of strength to negotiate. And that is what you have to do, because Putin's negotiations are the same: denazification, whatever that means, demilitarization, Ukrainian neutrality, boots on the ground sort of process, give up Crimea and the other areas that the Russian army has taken. That's not a peace negotiation, that's a diktat. So the point is to be able to get Ukraine to a position of strength, to be able to negotiate from that position of strength.
So that's Ukraine.
Yes.
Another consequence you mention is that it would encourage and sort of incentivize Western nations to station more NATO troops permanently within Eastern Europe on sort of Russia's front lawn, as it were. How important do you think that is?
Well, I'm not certain I would say it's Russia's front lawn. I'm sure the Estonians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians would be a little bit concerned to hear that it's they're Russia's front lawn.
Sure.
Sorry, just have to say that. But I think that certainly it gives greater impetus if we declare Putin as illegitimate, if we don't see him as the viable leader of Russia, we see him as a challenge. And this is an existential challenge for the West as much as it is for Russia and for Ukraine. The Russian propaganda has been saying for years, even before this happened, we are at war with the West. Ukraine is just a battleground. And the West finally needs to get real. That whilst there aren't British soldiers or French soldiers or German soldiers in Ukraine, at least officially, then they're fighting and dying, Russia believes it is at war with the West. And so this is a process. By standing strong, you send a signal to Russia, and the Russian government relies on signals. I'm not saying Russia is weak. Russia is always stronger than it's perceived to be, but weaker than it actually believes itself to be. But it would send a signal to Russia. And I think one of the mistakes that perhaps, I understand why, obviously, why Rishi Sunak, was it Rishi Sunak? No, Boris Johnson pulled soldiers out soldiers who were supporting and training the Ukrainians out of Ukraine, along with his Canadian and Lithuanian counterparts. Why they did that? Because if British soldiers died in Ukraine, obviously it wouldn't look great. But it sends a terrible signal to Putin, believing that the West didn't care about Ukraine, wasn't going to support it when times got tough, and therefore it was the final catalyst for actually invading, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. What should have happened was these people who were training the Ukrainians should have stayed. It would have sent a stronger signal to the Kremlin. What I'm trying to say is this is all about signals. If we put permanent deployment of soldiers, as Germany has done in Latvia, into Estonia, rather than rotating those soldiers around, I don't think Putin is going to invade Estonia. I could be wrong. Who knows what happens tomorrow? But so much has happened in the last few years. But I don't think Putin will invade NATO. He doesn't need to. He just needs to show Article 5 is broken. It won't work. So if we deploy soldiers permanently to places like Estonia, to Eastern Europe in general, Western European countries, Canada, North America, it would send a signal to Putin that NATO is ready. NATO is going to defend every inch of its territory. And that would also make it much harder for the Kremlin, if it did decide to do these, maybe not a full-scale invasion of Estonia or Finland, but to try to destabilize these countries, it would think again.
And so now we loop back to Russia, as I mentioned a moment ago. Let's say all of that took place. What would be the consequences of that within the corridors of the Kremlin? The Kremlin, sorry, among Putin's political advisors and confidants, and those also within the Kremlin who are maybe against the war but aren't making that known to their colleagues. Would there be fractures if this show of strength was demonstrated by the West?
I think there would be. I mean, there are fractures even now, although we never see them. When we talk about the Russian government, when we talk about the Kremlin, when we talk about Putin, it's never just, whilst Russia is a personalist autocracy, it's not just Putin. It's not, as Louis XVI, or I think it's Louis XVI, the tas c'est moi, the state is me. Putin would probably say the same thing, but it really isn't. Even with Louis XVI, it wasn't just him; it was his, attachés as well. So there are different factions, is what I'm trying to say, in the Kremlin, and there always have been. The West would need to speak to them, and I know that sounds terrible. The idea of a great powers concert like the Treaty of Berlin after the Napoleonic War, and other smaller states just have to accept what's happened. I'm not saying this. Certainly, this would not lead to the West coming to a peace deal with Russia above Ukrainian heads. That's by the by. This has to be separate. And it doesn't necessarily need to be Western governments. It could be so-called friendly states that the Russians claim are friendly towards them, Brazil, South Africa. Britain could take a lead on this, one, by declaring Putin illegitimate, and hopefully other states, Western states, would then follow, in the same way that Britain sent Challenger tanks first, and other countries then sent their tanks. Also with Storm Shadows, and other countries follow suit. Also into giving Ukraine security guarantees, and we're seeing Western states doing that as well. So Britain could also start talking to the Brazilians or the South Africans or whoever about a free trade deal. That could then get them to start talking to people within the Kremlin, or people who were formerly in government in Britain could also be doing it. And Britain has been talking to the Kremlin in the past about wider security concerns, but could also be doing this, because there needs to be a way to show the elite that it isn't just that Putin really is the problem, that it isn't Russians per se, and that they can have a future in a future Russia, whatever that will be, that if there is a coherent plan. In regards to Putin, it would also show to his elites that by being declared illegitimate, he is increasingly isolated, and he has taken Russia down a particularly dark path. Most of these people, at least the hardliners, consider themselves to be Russian patriots. And so if you can show them a better plan, they might just shift. Also, the modernizers have, on the whole, been planning towards a more open economy, a better economy with lots of projects for a better Russia, a stronger economic Russia. Those have gone because of the war. The economy, yes, it's doing better than we expected. Sanctions should be tightened, but it's overheating because it is placed in a war economy, and the Kremlin has a difficulty in trying to maintain consumerism and at the same time a war machine. And that's very, very difficult. A lot of countries fail on that. So what I'm trying to get at is, by talking to the elites, it gives them an idea as to what the future could be and where they might be able to fit in. It also gives them the incentives to perhaps move Putin on, and also it undermines his own regime. He himself already believes that people are out to get him. He's increasingly paranoid. I would say his inner circle is getting smaller. If he finds out that someone has been talking to people in the West, to governments in the West or authorities in the West, that person will be removed. That's repression. That will also then incentivize other elites that maybe Putin needs to be moved on. If they don't tell him, and he doesn't find out, he will assume they're doing it anyway, and so it increases the paranoia, and this becomes a very mixed issue. This is, it's difficult to say. There are some who would argue that this will unite the elites behind Putin. I disagree with this idea because we've seen plenty of factions in the Russian government over many years. They all have different incentives, and if you can show them what a future Russia could be and what role they could play in it, that is a way to start splitting the elite. And even if the West doesn't actually manage to split the elite, Putin will assume it's happening anyway, and so will coerce his elites, and so it becomes very, very murky, let's say.
With the elections, I know you said they've already begun, but with the elections coming up, we have seen attacks from Ukraine into Russian territory. Is it significant, do you think, that they are happening just before people vote?
I think it's so significant, yes, because it allows the Ukrainians have clearly made the decision, and the Russian Legion is not part of the Ukrainian army, but it's affiliated with Ukraine. It's fighting on their side to highlight to the Russian electorate that they aren't safe. It's also, I think, interesting in terms of whether they will try and escalate. They've hit oil refineries with drones, whether they will try and also hit the Kremlin, because I think that a lot of Russians are actually very supportive of the fact that Putin was almost assassinated. So it also gives hope, I would say, in that respect. My biggest worry is that this could also have ramifications in terms of uniting Russians in support of Putin. But when you're at war, then you obviously want to take the war to the enemy, and Ukraine at the moment has not been given the supplies from the West that it should have received, and so is having to think outside the box, as it were, and taking the war to Russia and trying to highlight that Russians aren't safe, that Putin has taken Russia to war. This isn't a special military operation. This is a war, and therefore the thinking, I'm assuming, I don't know what's happening in Kiev, but I'm assuming that the thinking would be that that Russians will worry about the fact that Putin has taken Russia into a very different, dark place, and so that could be one reason why it might induce protests. I assume that might be the thinking in Kiev. I'm reticent in believing that there will be mass protests, but we will see what happens when most people, I assume, will vote, which will be Sunday.